Um, Today we're going to tell you a little bit about IDEAL, Iowa Digital Engagement and Learning, and specifically about its project called Archives Alive. So IDEAL, again, Iowa Digital Engagement and Learning, started with support from Instructional Technologies and ITS and Steve Flegel, who helped us put together a proposal to then Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education, Beth Ingram, for some student success funds, which we were awarded, thankfully, and we're here today because of the support of those people and the support of the rhetoric department, which allowed Tom and I to give some of our efforts without any pay.
I think you did get a course release in the first version.
One course release,
Yeah.
Which was instrumental, I have to say.
Yeah.
Well, IDEAL was created with the mission to expand the tile approach beyond the tile classrooms. In other words, to get collaborative and inquiry-based learning out into the curriculum without necessarily relying on the tile classroom technology. So how do we do that? Well, we do it with interdisciplinary, project-based assignment models that push learning beyond the classroom walls and beyond the textbook through experiential learning and other means that result in digitally composed projects with a public audience. We do a lot to accomplish the mission of IDEAL, including once a year we run an Assignment Design Institute, where we invite faculty to get together and talk about redesigning just one of their assignments for their course, so that it relies on the principles that Randy Bass was talking about this morning. So if there's one place to start, one assignment might be that place, just one. We're here more specifically today to talk to you about Archives Alive. Archives Alive came about after some initial success by IDEAL. We were approached by two wonderful librarians, Jen Wolfe and Kelly McElroy. Both, unfortunately, have taken jobs elsewhere. They're working wonderful jobs, but not here with us any longer. But they came to us with a question: how do we teach DIY history? Now, DIY history is an initiative by the libraries for crowdsourcing the transcription of documents the libraries holds in its special collection that are not readable by a computer. So they can't be essentially transcribed into searchable text by a computer. They need a human being to do that. The crowdsourcing initiative attracts a lot of hobby historians, retirees with time on their hands, and a lot of rhetoric students because of our assignment. So we'll tell you a little bit more about that. How do we teach DIY history was the question we were presented. In 2013, in the spring of 2013, we piloted a project in which students would both, as Bass said this morning, learn to create and create to learn. That project involved essentially 5 steps. First, students would go into DIY history and transcribe a document. In fact, only a single page of a document was required. Second, they composed a 400 to 500 word historical contextualization of that document. So they had to do some initial research into where that document fit into the history of its time and place. And then a 400 word to 500 word rhetorical analysis. This is arising out of our rhetoric department's emphasis on analysis as a skill that transcends our course and has meaning in the rest of the curriculum across the university. That was followed by students being asked to compose a screencast video in which they featured some of the salient parts of their letter that led them to inquiry about the history and the rhetoric behind it. That screencast video was composed in the pilot semester on one kind of software, and the second semester on another, and in the third semester we were able to support it on a variety of platforms. In fact, students driving the bus themselves found answers that they wanted to use particular technologies to do it, and we were able to allow that. And finally, it results in all of these 4 steps result in a speech performance in which students stand up in front of a group of their peers, their instructor, and the public in the library learning commons. And they deliver a speech in which they embody the inquiry that they've conducted. And today we're lucky to have a student who's going to deliver her speech presentation for us. Well, what do I think are the strengths of this assignment? First, that it's iterative. In other words, students come up with one way of seeing their document, and then another and another. 5 separate iterations at least. So they return to that document at least that many times. They reinvent questions. They refine their thinking about that document. Second, it's collaborative. Because students work in a particular archive of materials, they're talking to one another. They're talking to me. They're talking to librarians about the meanings that they're discovering. They're teaching each other much more about these archives than they could have discovered on their own. Next, that it's student-centered. In other words, students get to choose their document. They get to decide how they pursue it historically. They get to decide what's relevant about it rhetorically. And it's skills-focused. Throughout the whole assignment, students are learning the skills of digital composition, alphabetic composition, and public presentation skills, to name just a few. Finally, it is truly experiential learning. They are expected to interact with something that they don't find in a textbook, that exists beyond the classroom. It exists in the public sphere, even in a digital archive in DIY histories. So ideal is housed in rhetoric. Actually, it's not.
No?
Ideal exists between me and Tom.
Yeah, here it is.
But it has its roots in rhetoric, and why is that? Well, because rhetoric is a department that values all of those things. The iterative nature of education, collaboration, student-centered learning, skills-focused instruction, and experiential learning. Next, Elise Kerns will present and discuss her Archives Alive project for us. And afterward, Tom Keegan is going to talk about Ideal's next project, Collections to Classes Initiative, which further solidifies Ideal's connection to the libraries that was forged in Archives Alive. There'll be plenty of time, I hope, for questions and discussion afterward. Okay? So I'll turn it over to Elise. And Elise, I can drive your slides, and you're used to making me do that, aren't you?
Yeah, sure.
Unless you'd rather do it yourself.
I'll do it myself.
Okay. Who's in control?
That's right. So when I first got the assignment, we had the pages from the libraries where we had all the collection of different letters. And it was just like these blocks of different letters, and I was just looking for something that was interesting, like what letter should I pick, World War I, World War II, whatever. And I came across these letters that had these like little red stickers that were like in shapes of hearts, and they were like, I was like, oh, this is so cute, like this uplifting letter about this like nonchalant person talking about their life at home. And in the beginning, that's all my letter really was. It was this nonchalant, kind of sarcastic letter that didn't really ever mention war. And of course, so like most things in life, it turned out to be far more complex than that and ended up being something that I did not anticipate, but has come to be one of the most emotional experiences I've had with a project ever. And so my letter was written by Willametta Turnipseed from Springfield, Ohio, to her fiancé at the time, Burton J. Smith, who was stationed in England as part of the Air Force. When I was doing my historical context of everything, I found out that he died in a plane crash on September 1st, 1944. And because the letter was in such like an uplifting tone and everything, and it didn't really mention war, I was like operating under the impression that he had survived. And so it kind of came across like, oh, he died. But then the date really stuck out to me, and I couldn't remember why the date of September 1st seemed so familiar. And then I realized that it was the same day that Willametta wrote this letter. And so everything kind of fell into place and became incredibly more meaningful because it was no longer a correspondence, but it was a soliloquy. He never read the letter, and it was the last letter she ever wrote to him, and he never even got to hear it. And so the last line that she says to him is, "I feel you are all right." And that just like rung in my ears the whole time. And I actually over break talked to my mom about this and about how that kind of stuck with me, like, I feel you are all right, and here he doesn't even read that. It didn't even make it to him. My mom said that maybe it was because she did feel like he was all right because he was no longer at war. So that stung in me. And I was trying to figure out why that she was so good at talking about everything without ever actually talking about it. Like she was talking about home and everything that was going on. She didn't actually say, "I miss you." And it turns out that she wrote for a love story magazine, and all story love stories, and she wrote little short stories, and they were very like, oh, when will he come home, and when is he going to be here? And it was very, tutti-frutti, romantic, everything. And she didn't write anything after he died. And it was like she didn't want to talk about homecoming because it was a distant mythology that she never got to see come to fruition. He didn't come home, so she stopped writing these magazines, and in turn stopped writing the letters to him. And she never mentions the war specifically, only talks about the victory of it all, and only talks about it as if it was this complete thing that she doesn't even want to mention. But she doesn't actually mention V-Day. Instead, she mentions X-Day, because she says the war is only half won, and X is an unknown quantity that is lost in the war. And so it's not a victory day, it is an X-Day, because there's an amount that is lost that you cannot regain. And that was another example of the way that she was kind of removing herself from the experience of war and keeping it centered on home. But again, without ever actually saying, I miss you. And so she also mentions the troop train. And I was like, well, troop train, whatever that is. And then it turns out that what I thought was her kind of nonchalantly mentioning this friend that was going on the troop train, turned out that there was a great troop train crash of 1944 that was one of the greatest home front disasters of the entire Second World War. And so again, something else that I was just thinking was this nonchalant thing turned out to be incredibly weighty. She wasn't just mentioning this friend that was going on this troop train. She was mentioning this friend because she knew that her husband was in danger, but she didn't want to say, how are you doing? Because that would make it real. And so the whole letter, in the way that it kind of resonated with me, was that it wasn't unique. There's nothing about her story that is terribly special. She is quite literally one in a million. She's a paragon of the widows and the people that have left with the remnant memories of their loved ones and the remains of their marriages, and they never got to say goodbye. But it was the not saying I miss you, and it was the not saying that war was real that kept it so removed and kept her feeling so strong. And that's what really stuck with me. And I can attribute that partially for my own inquiry going into it and me taking charge of it, but also with the emotional connection that I ended up having with the letter. And it still is in my mind today because of the last lines that she wrote to him and the fact that she didn't say these things that normally would say, or even asking him how he was. And maybe she did feel that he was all right, even though he didn't come home. But that wasn't what was important. What was important was that she was mentioning home because that's what he needed. And after all, isn't that what we all need? So, citations.
I will be, thank you so much for that. That is, you make us look very wise. I'll be brief because I'd like to have questions. As Matt said, you know, Archives Alive is a joint venture between the libraries and Rhetoric, and I started my professional career. I did my PhD in English here, but for the last 4 years I was a lecturer in the Rhetoric department where Matt and I started Ideal. I'm now the head of digital research and publishing for the libraries. And you know, we really are grateful to Jen Wolfe and Kelly McElroy for helping take this tool, which is that DIY History is in part a transcription tool for special collections, right, to transcribe the manuscript archive. But if you take the time to rethink how that tool can be used, it becomes this really powerful, I think as we've seen, pedagogical tool in the classroom and a learning tool. We don't think that that should be a singular experience, particularly at Iowa. Not for the students, not for that particular course for Rhetoric, which is required of all undergraduates, and not for DRP or the libraries. And so one of the things we've begun to think about very recently is a joint venture between Ideal, DRP, it's a bunch of acronyms, but the Learning Commons, LC, and RLI in the library, which is it's research and library instruction, right? I'm right. Okay. All right. There you go. Okay. So and so that was a meeting between Brittany Thomas, Kathy Magrill, Matt, and myself, and our new hire, our new Kelly, but our new Katie Hassman, right? It's like, okay, yeah, Kelly's gone. And so the five of us were talking about how can we move things like this more effectively into the classroom. And one of the beauties, I think, of Archives Alive is that, you know, Rhetoric, now that we have a minor, we can offer some different courses and see different years of students. But typically, and by far and away, our largest demographic are freshmen. It's a required course for all undergraduates. And what better time than, you know, their first semester, second semester in college to say, here's what primary research looks like. Here's how you compose things digitally. And then hopefully those lessons get, you know, reinscribed over and over again, or we hope increasingly. So one of our tasks, or our ambitions, I suppose, is to reach out to the gen eds and say, look, here students have to take and there's a lot of them, you know, and maybe not all are as ripe for this kind of approach as others, but if there are people who are interested in collaborating with the libraries in terms of, and Matt said, this initiative that I tentatively titled Collections to Courses, because to put it in the reverse would suggest they have to come to us, which is not the way DIY history works, right? It basically comes to them through their digital devices. So if there are collections that are applicable and useful, which I can't imagine there's any that aren't, it just depends on which course you pair them with, how can we reimagine what the teaching that makes use of those collections looks like in the hands of students? And that's very much what digital research and publishing was one of the many things we do, and we're really focused on the objectives that Ideal, I think, has so stylishly and effectively cultivated over the past 3 years. So, and that being said, we're happy to take questions just of student experience, how Ideal comes up, or future projects. Yeah.
I just need a little more information about what it is. So,
Sure.
So could I look at like a bunch of letters from World War II, for example,
Yes,
as
of course.
like a data set?
Yes.
Okay, so I teach research methods, and I've actually been looking for an assignment like this for a long time. So James McPherson, this really the famous Civil War writer, found a whole bunch of letters from the North and the South, and he did this content analysis for why people fight. And he used very much all of the research methodologies that you would use in a quantitative study, looking at samples from populations, et cetera, et cetera. And I've always kind of wanted to look for a data set for my students to do the same thing, to understand that, like, you know, all letters don't make up the whole population. You don't have every letter that was ever written in World War II, right? But you have some. And you can use that to extrapolate processes and ideas and things like that happen the same way McPherson did. So could I use the data set like that?
Yes. Yeah.
Is it big enough? Like that's what I'm saying. Like I need more.
We just last year surpassed 50,000 pages transcribed. So I mean that's what you're looking at in terms of transcription. There's a lot more in there, and you know right now we have about 7 different collections. So there's a railroad collection, World War I, World War II, Civil War, Pioneer Lives, which is a lot of 19th century Norwegians writing home. The Zathmary collection, which is that's our new initiative this year. We're using the Zathmary collection. That's what I piloted with. Pioneer Lives was good, but a lot of these things end up in like the Iowa Women's Archive has actually been has been the largest contributor, arguably, to the World War II. In fact, the stuff that we initially worked with World War II came out of the Evelyn Berkby World War II scrapbook, and that was housed in the Iowa Women's Archive. And there was like half a dozen guys writing back to her during the war. So yeah, we can. Well, she was big on keeping up morale. So it resonated. We have all these letters, and it was but yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if there's any, and on the technical end, talking about data sets and how they get used, we're happy to work with any. I mean, we are not and I feel like I can say this because I'm in charge now, but like whereas before, Paul was in charge of DRP, but now he's in charge of me, but not DRP necessarily. And so we're not a department or a unit or whatever we are that says no. And we certainly don't think that we're prescriptive in terms of here's what you need. So when faculty or graduate students, instructors, or undergraduates say, well, what if I did this? Something I tell my staff all the time, with new hires in particular, is if you've ever been frustrated by what you wanted to do and you didn't have a welcoming ear, you have that now. It may not work, but I'd rather try it and fail and know that it didn't, and then try and revise our approach the next time. So if you're saying, well, can we do this with this data set, or can we do this with this collection? The answer is we can certainly try to. And I'm happy to do that, and I think Matt feels the same way about Ideal. And I know the rhetoric department, even more broadly, is always open to collaboration with other departments.
So all this is online, so like let's say students in a tile classroom and they all have access, whatever, they can have individual access to go into this.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I often teach in, it's public. And I often teach in tile classrooms, and it's great when you do digital projects in a tile classroom, which you can replicate to an extent that experience because students have, phablets like the iPhone 6 Plus or iPads, and they bring in, and all of a sudden, as long as the digital tools are there, they can sit down next to one another in these kind of archaic classrooms, if they're not lucky enough to be in a tile room, and recreate the experience.
Mark, I'd like to ask a question of Elise. Please. Just thinking about the doability of this for any student, could you just talk a little bit about the decisions and the steps, and just moving from choosing a letter and then to finding context? Like working with a librarian, working with your teacher, finding that there was a way in order to find out about the troop train, and find about the day that he died.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough that my letter was part of a collection between Wilmette and Burton. They wrote practically every day. And so there was an entire section from the libraries specifically about their kind of correspondence. And so in that, there had some background information about where they were from, and it had the day that he died. So that was, I was lucky enough to have that in the library information of it all. Stuff about the troop train and everything was just kind of me, going online and being like, what's the troop train, and then like putting my specific date, like 1944 troop train, and then looking specifically at like new periodicals and like news articles that had to do with that day. And I looked up the Times magazine specific for my date that I had, and then I looked in the historical context of what was going on that day. And so I basically took the whole like what was going on in the news route to find out historical context, and then to rhetorically analyze it from a point for the project itself. That was me basically saying like, why is this relevant, her specific story, to the larger context of everything. And so for me, it was a lot of online research, and then I was going to go to find a picture of Willamette, and I ended up finding out that it was in a yearbook that was currently in Ohio. And so I contacted the people that were at the place that held the yearbook, and they just never got back to me. So but it exists. There's a picture of her. It's in a yearbook in Ohio, so I didn't get it. So that was me. That was a lot. That was like I probably put aside 2 days to just find concrete information about the two of them, which is when I found out, oh, she wrote for this magazine, and then I found out the list of all the different stories that she wrote, and I tried to read them, and I couldn't get any of them. But so that was just like, I had to put aside time to focus on kind of niche research that I wanted to do about the two of them specifically. And so I think that if you're, like, I just got progressively more interested in it, because it wasn't just like this letter, it was like these people that I started to imagine complexly instead of one-dimensionally. And so for me, it was just like me taking charge of that to then make it so that I could apply it more so.
And just thinking of anybody doing this, what kind of help were you given at each stage? Did you actually then say, well, how would I find out more about this? Or did somebody say, well, you can look up this thing?
Yeah, Professor Gilchrist, he definitely, it was like, yeah, you can go to libraries and they can give you more information on it. But most of my stuff I did online, and I just kept going link after link after link after link, and just put hours aside to just find out specific little information. I would have 2 hours of research just to find the exact Time magazine cover that I wanted, but it was worth it in the end, and it was very gratifying. And so for me, it was just...
Yeah, we should say Kelly, when she was here, made us a really wonderful live guide for this assignment, so it's like putting together a page where students could link to newspaper databases, which they often love, because all of a sudden, like when I first did Pioneer Lives, oh, there was lined paper in 1903, which is like weird for them, or hats in 1940, who knew? Like they don't, all of a sudden, like the past is real when you see a picture of it that you went in search of rather than was given to you?
Yes, definitely, and that's like why it put more, I think part of the reason I had more of a connection with it is because I pursued it on my own, but I had resources available for me if I wanted to pursue it in a way that I didn't find information that I felt was sufficient. But I got a lot of it that I needed kind of off the bat, and the rest of it I just pursued independently.
I think we're getting the cue that it's time to close here.